Volunteer tourism is a type of tourism that I happen to know quite a lot about. Not only have I been a volunteer tourist in multiple locations around the world, but I also studied this concept at length as part of my PhD research. And in today's video, I'm going to give you an overview or a sort of general introduction to the volunteer tourism industry, what it is, what you can do as a volunteer tourist, why it's good and why it's bad. And if you are really interested to learn more about volunteer tourism, this is actually just the first video in a series of videos about volunteer tourism. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of the future videos that will be released very soon. And if there is something specific you want to know, let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get to it. What is volunteer tourism? In brief, volunteer tourism is a type of tourism where an individual will travel abroad to a destination that is predominantly considered undeveloped or developing to offer their support to those in need. And when we use the phrase those in need, which is expressed a lot in volunteering, we are usually referring to those who are surrounded by poverty. They do not have adequate education and healthcare facilities, and they frequently have little building infrastructure. And if you are doing any research on volunteer tourism, you might be a bit confused about the terminology that is often used. Often in academic or industry-based discussions, you will come across the terms voluntourism, volunteerism, volunteer travel. But don't be confused, because each term basically is referring to the same thing. It's the joining of both words, volunteering and tourism. Volunteer tourism is a specific form of tourism designed purposely to provide a product or service to meet the needs of a particular market segment, meaning it falls under the umbrella of niche tourism. There are many organisations, for example Projects Abroad, which offer a range of different volunteer tourism projects. Volunteering opportunities are generally located, as I mentioned before, in less developed countries such as Nepal, Ghana, Cambodia or South Africa. Whilst there isn't a wealth of data on volunteer tourism projects, TRAM, Tourism Research and Marketing, did do some research back in 2008, and they found that volunteers will typically pay on average £2,000 for the privilege of being a volunteer tourist. Unfortunately, there doesn't appear to be any more recent statistics. If you found some, let me know in the comments because I haven't, but I would love to know if it does exist out there. But what we can generally take from that is prices have gone up since 2008, so we can assume that the price nowadays is more than £2,000 on average. This cost typically covers housing, meals, projects, materials, administration and on-site staff support. Unfortunately, it also usually results in a hefty profit in the pockets of the volunteer tourism host organisation too. And I will talk more about this shortly. Stephen Wearing is the guru, so to speak, of volunteer tourism research, and he first defined it as tourists who undertake holidays that might involve aiding or alleviating the material poverty of some groups in society, the restoration of certain environments or research into aspects of society or environment. Volunteering projects were originally predominantly organised by charities and were philanthropic in nature. However, the trend in volunteer tourism has somewhat shifted now. It's shifted away from this altruistic activity into the arms of for-profit tour operators who often charge large amounts and share little of the profits with those who are in need. Volunteer tourism is now a billion-dollar industry, and whilst it really can do a lot of good, it does require appropriate management to be employed in order to ensure that these benefits are maximised. Okay, so now that we understand what volunteer tourism is, let's have a look at some examples of what you can do if you want to be a volunteer tourist. There are actually many different ways that we can be a volunteer tourist, and this can be broken down into sectors. The first sector is community welfare. Within this sector, you might have a position in childcare, looking after the elderly, caring for disabled people, or working with human rights or legal rights. There's teaching. Here you could be teaching English as a foreign language, which is probably the most common. You could also be sports coaching or teaching in some other regard. There's the environmental sector. Here you might be working in nature conservation, wildlife protection, or alleviation of global warming. The medical sector involves working in hospital support as well as pandemic support. For example, working with people who have HIV, Ebola, or maybe even COVID. There's the building sector too, which employs lots of people to work in construction and renovation. And then there is the research sector, where people may be involved in wildlife monitoring, land mapping and zoning, or any other research that's required. And there are lots of different reasons why people choose to become a volunteer tourist. With volunteer tourism becoming more and more popular, particularly amongst the younger generation, many people are asking, why? Well, there are actually lots of reasons. Some people want to be a volunteer tourist because they want the opportunity to travel. Some people want the camaraderie, they want to make friends, develop new networks. Some people want to develop their skills, for example, their teaching skills or their medical skills. Altruism is a big driver. Some people just want to help and do good. Some people are in search of the adventure that volunteer tourism can provide. And other people are seeking personal growth and development. There is for sure a big educational benefit for volunteer tourists, and for some this is their major motivation. And some people want to learn a language. Some people will become volunteer tourists because their family or their friends want them to do it. And others just like the structure of the program. They think it looks fun. It appeals to them. Some people want a deep, cultural, immersive experience. And some people just want to do something a little bit different. Religion sometimes plays a role, and oftentimes volunteer tourists are in seek of a personal challenge. They want to push themselves. Sometimes being a volunteer is part of a formal course, and some people do it because they just want to have the opportunity to live in another country or another destination. Some people embark on volunteer tourism because of the cost. It can help to prolong your travels by providing cheaper places to stay, for example. And some people just simply want to escape. So as with anything, if we want to have a really great industry that is sustainable, we do need to assess what's good about it and what's not so good about it. And volunteer tourism really can be a force for good. It can help the host community, help them to develop, help them to have better lives. It can help direct money to areas that wouldn't normally benefit from tourism. So there's an economic benefit there. It can help to promote cross-cultural understanding, help us learn about the way different people live. It can help to reduce racial, cultural and social boundaries. And it allows volunteers to use their skills that locals might not have. This is especially the case for teaching English or working in the medical field, for example. Volunteer tourism can help to enhance social capital, and it can help to contribute towards international development. But as with any type of tourism, there are unfortunately negative impacts too. And the priority of any good volunteer tourism management should be to minimise these negative impacts. Unfortunately, there are quite a lot, but I'll just give you a few examples for now. There could be limited benefits because volunteer tourism placements are often short. How much difference will a teacher make if they're only there for 2 weeks? There can be a big culture shock, both for the tourist and for the locals. And sometimes it is not clear where the money that the tourist spends to be a volunteer has been spent. Sometimes the volunteer tourism experience is not as the volunteer expected it to be. And in some cases, the volunteer might not be able to actually see what difference they've made. Sadly, there are examples of simulated volunteer tourism. In other words, when a project is created just to attract the tourists and to make money. And I have read some really horrible examples actually of volunteer tourists who paid quite hefty sums of money, and they might, for example, build a toilet, and when they leave, that toilet block might be knocked down and the next group will build it again. And this obviously is not good. When working as a volunteer tourist, there can be language barriers, physical hardships, For example, insects, lack of sleep, physical exertion. There might be a lack of amenities or activities. And there might, if it's not managed well, be a general neglect on what the locals actually need. Sometimes volunteer tourists don't produce the highest quality of work, especially if they're not experts in that field. If you asked me to build a house, I wouldn't do the best job because I don't have a clue how to do it. There may be a lack of financial and vocational benefits that are directed towards the local community, and there could be a general reinforcement of conceptualizations of the other. And there are some examples around the world where the local people are actually displaced or they have their jobs taken away from them because volunteer tourists will come and do it for free. This is not good for the local economy. And in some cases, the local environments and the communities are actually exploited by the volunteer tourism organisations for profit. Which is why I recommend, if you are considering doing a volunteer tourism trip, you look very carefully at the organisation that you are thinking of booking through. And make sure it's really transparent where your money is going. In general, there is a lack of regulation throughout the sector, which can yield a number of issues. And hosts are sometimes really upset or devastated when the volunteer programs are up. For example, many volunteers will develop really quite strong bonds with young children when they are teaching them or coaching them. And those children are pretty upset when they leave. There can also be undesirable power relations that are created between the host and the volunteer. As with anything, it's all about careful management in order to make sure it works well. And what better way to do that than to teach people? So if you're interested in more, do subscribe. I've got more videos on this coming. And while you're waiting, take a look at some of these videos next.